great. So our goal was really to have a conversation today. So we have some slides that are really sparked at just getting the conversation rolling and getting to what your specific questions are around Michigan and the evidence in general. So we'll start with kind of the big picture of the US, where kids are, and then Anna will shift to what's happening specifically within Michigan, okay? Okay, so, I really like to start with this slide in early childhood conversations because it comes directly from our kindergarten teachers, right? And who knows where kids are at better than the people who have to wrangle them and get them, happy, productive members of a kindergarten class. So these are data from 2010, and what it is really a snapshot of what our kindergarten teacher voices are in this country. And that is that they're telling us that about half of the kids that come into their classrooms in fall of kindergarten aren't ready. And that's larger when you break it down by income. So for kids from the bottom 20% of family income, that's nearing 70%. And then also for kids of color, those percentages are lower, right? So kids essentially, based on the investments that we're able to make now, aren't where they deserve to be on that first day of kindergarten. Now, you might say we do so much in K-12, and in fact, we invest more than many of our peer nations in K-12 and in higher education. So maybe it's okay, we can get them caught up. But the reality is that when you look at all of the test score data we have, what you see is that kiddos who come in behind on the first day of kindergarten don't catch up. So most of the readiness gap or the achievement gap that we see in 8th grade and high school was actually in place on the first day of kindergarten. You can trace it back. So we do a little bit of narrowing in early elementary school, but by 3rd grade, it's widened again back to where it was and then continues to widen a little bit. And so that's age along the x-axis, and then the difference between kids at the top of the income distribution versus the bottom there. Okay, so clearly we need to be doing more to figure out how we get more kids ready on that first day. And at the federal level, overall, we're not doing much. This is a snapshot of where we are versus other OECD nations, and we rank 30 out of 31st in the percent of our GDP that we put towards this area. And that's why it's so important, the kind of work that you're all doing on the local level, because we're not solving these problems at the federal level, and we're not seeing much traction now, on one attempt to Build Back Better to try to make more systematic federal investments in this area. So in terms of the preschool evidence base, and I would be happy to talk specifically if folks have questions about Tennessee. That is something that I led a group of economists, ed policy, and child developmentalists in thinking through and put out a piece in Brookings that I'd be happy to talk through. But the broad evidence base, which includes studies that go back in the 60s and 70s, we have over 70 of these studies that have been reasonably well done, are pretty conclusive that preschool really does better prepare kids for kindergarten versus staying home with a family member, and the effects can last into adulthood. We know that the benefits too are larger for families where the children grow up in a low-income family household, dual language learner households, and for children of color. And we also know that parents tell us they want to send their kids to preschool. For 3- and 4-year-olds, that's where parents say in surveys they mostly would like their kids to be. And without public supports, a lot of them, and that tends to be in many places, particularly middle income families, because we target, like we do in Michigan, our public programs really to families at the bottom. And then folks who just miss the cutoff really struggle to find high quality options of the kind that they would like. So the preschool fade out has been with us since the 60s, really. So this Tennessee study that, again, we could talk more about is really nothing new in terms of the broader pattern. So it's pretty much the case that we see this readiness boost in kindergarten, and then we tend to see that the kids who don't attend pre-K are catching up in those first years, say kindergarten, 1st grade, 2nd grade, on basic literacy and math skills. And so on many of the tests we give in those areas, then you don't see as much of a difference, or sometimes you see no difference. So one clue we have about that is that as we scale these pre-K programs, we actually also have to change what's going on in K-3. right? So one signal that we have from several randomized trials is that if you change what the kindergarten teacher is doing so that she's not repeating what the pre-K attenders already learned, that boost can continue to grow. And that's an area of emerging research that is really getting at how you need to align these systems really from birth to 8, rather than thinking of them as, one-shot magic here can do it all on its own. But despite that kind of fade out in those early grades, a really important take-home message is, it always takes us 20 years to know how the kids are going to be doing, because you have to give them time to grow up, right? So are we going to keep seeing those returns on things like high school graduation and earnings? And the reality is that most of the time, even if we saw those medium test scores shrink to 0, the difference between those who went and who didn't, we still see boosts on high school graduation. We still see boosts on earning time and time again. So one of the other big pieces that's really important to think about, and especially with a group like yours, is, where are we on the programs we have? Like, are they doing a good job? Where could they do better? And so the good news is through regulation, really, that we've been able to get for most programs in a good spot in terms of class size, teacher-child ratios, basic safety, and also emotional climate. We've done a good job of keeping kids safe when they're in these programs and making them happy to be there, essentially. And this is just a snapshot of a policy brief that a doctoral student and I have coming out through the Gates Foundation, in which we were looking at some of these factors. And so what we were looking at was when you take observational quality measures, so you've sent someone in to observe what's going on in these systems, and you're looking at things around, is the classroom clean? Are the kids being supported? Is it an organized environment? You can see that in these pretty different systems around the country, from Boston Pre-K to California's program, National Head Start, New York City Pre-K, that they're pretty much all clearing the bar on things like emotional support, an organized classroom. Where they're falling down is on instructional support. And we'll talk through that one, Anna and I will, a little bit more around making sure kids are getting the kinds of supportive but play-based learning opportunities in these classrooms that really build their thinking and get them ready for kindergarten. So in terms of the places to push, and including here in Michigan, it's not uncommon for teacher compensation to really lag in preschool and early childhood programs versus in K-12, right? And in places like Michigan, where we require the same degree to teach in the Great Start Readiness School program, but we pay teachers a lot less, it's no surprise that we then see higher turnover and quality challenges. Because if I like teaching 4-year-olds, I'm probably going to like teaching 5-year-olds, and I'm definitely going to like making $30,000 more a year, right? So that's a problem that's in place all around the country in many systems, including in Michigan. But some places have shown that parity is possible. You just have to invest in it, and then you see lower turnover. Another thing that we've seen, this is an economist at Dartmouth, Elizabeth Cassio, has done a really wonderful study in which she has seen that universal programs tend to move the needle more on those 3rd grade reading outcomes than those that are income targeted. So if you take a program that only serves kids from low-income backgrounds versus those who let everybody in, like Oklahoma, you actually see that everybody is gaining more, but particularly poor kids if everybody's served. And that gets to that idea of, trade-offs between targeting to those who need the most help versus bringing everybody in and then having a more mixed income environment. And so, it's sort of that old thought around how programs for the poor can be poor programs, that letting in a wider mix of kids actually seems to be one of the active ingredients in getting a higher return for kids. And finally, returning to that instructional quality piece in terms of what's happening nationally. So we do know that it's barely adequate in most large scale systems. So we've done a really good job of making kids feel happy in the classroom, but we're not doing a really great job of actually teaching them. And we do know from a set of randomized trials over the last 15 years that we can really do better, and we can do better in many cases without a lot of added cost. So what it means is shifting from curricula that have been with us for a long time and are play-based and fun for kids, but don't really follow the science around how young kids learn. So there are other curricula that follow, that have a specific scope and sequence that kind of show you how does a kid, develop good math skills in kindergarten or in pre-K, and following that science and implementing it with the teacher results in a lot more learning gains than using this kind of more generic curriculum. But it's very hard to get systems to move to that. And that's something that I've spent the last 10 years going around the country talking to different systems, and we're starting to see the needle move in some places, but it's really an area of struggle just to get folks to pivot. And that's the case too, if you've seen any of this stuff around the science of reading, the ways in which folks are starting to pivot to more evidence-based reading curricula, that's another area in which within the 0 to 8 space, we're seeing some movement, but it's a slow process for getting systems to move. Okay, so Anna's going to take you through Michigan, and I should just, give a little plug that Anna's dissertation was using over 10 cohorts of Michigan kindergarten students. So when it comes to administrative data from the state, so she pretty much knows early childhood Michigan data as well as anything. So I'm going to hand it over to her.
Thanks. Yeah, so Chris has been, talking with us about the national picture of early childhood, but we thought it would be helpful to think kind of big picture. What are the access, what is the access to preschool in Michigan, and what do we know about the program that most Michigan children are attending? And so here what we're showing you is and this is taken from the American Community Survey, and it's the percent of 3 and 4-year-olds in different states across the country that are reporting, the parents are reporting that their child is either enrolled in a public school or a private school. And so this first bar is the United States, and you can see that fewer than half of children nationwide are attending any sort of school at age 3 and 4. And it's, a little bit more public than private, but more or less even. But then if we look at Michigan, we can see that, total, Michigan is pretty similar to the United States, but a higher share of kids are attending public programs versus private. And here we're comparing these to some of our other, peer Midwest states. And you can see Michigan is not doing quite as well as Illinois, but is doing a little bit better than Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And then finally, we wanted to show you what it looks like in DC to kind of highlight that this idea of getting a large share of children in preschool is not an impossible goal. DC has a really robust public preschool program. These numbers are actually a little bit of an undercount because it's combining 3s and 4s. But you can see that most children in Washington, DC are able to attend some sort of preschool program. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so thinking more about, I showed you that graph that has 3s and 4s combined. These figures are taken from the National Institute for Early Education Research, which is at Rutgers University and produces a document that some of you may have seen called the kind of National Yearbook. And they do profiles of each state and also the nation overall, and talk about kind of the state of preschool in the United States. And so here, these figures actually came out just yesterday. But here they're showing kind of over time, the percent of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds in Michigan that have been enrolled in state-funded programs. And what you can see is that Michigan is serving about 1/3 of its 4-year-olds and has been doing so since 2017, but that Michigan is still serving none of its 3-year-olds in public programs. So Michigan is doing a pretty good job compared to other states in getting public preschool attendance up for 4s, but has not really been able to expand that public access to 3-year-olds yet. And, I think the goal is to have access to high quality programs for 3s and 4s. So this is a piece that is still kind of missing in the public landscape. And then here we're showing on the next graph, just the number of state dollars that are being spent on students in public pre-K. And we should note that these figures don't include additional local expenditure that might be topping up some of these figures in certain localities. But you can see that there was a big bump up in state expenditure in 2020, but it went down in 2021. And a lot of this has to do with some of the ways that the pandemic has impacted early childhood participation, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then to dive in a little bit further, then, what exactly are these 4-year-olds doing in these state programs? Here, the first pie chart is showing the percent of 3-year-olds that are enrolled in a public program. And again, Michigan state programs don't serve any 3-year-olds, but you can see that about 9% of Michigan's 3-year-olds are attending the federal Head Start program, and then about 3% are attending programs through special education services. So if a child is identified as needing special education services at birth to 3, they are legally required to be given access to public programs. But then when we move to 4-year-olds, what you can see is that about 23% of Michigan's 4-year-olds are attending Michigan's Great Start Readiness Program. Another 8% are attending Michigan's developmental kindergarten programs, which you guys may have heard of as Young Fives or transitional kindergarten. And then another 7% are attending federal Head Start. But again, the vast majority of children in Michigan are not attending a publicly funded program, even at age 4. And so we also wanted to dive into what exactly is happening in Michigan's Great Start Readiness Program in particular, because that is the most predominant public program. And here what we're showing you is the near quality benchmark. So again, that's the same organization that puts out this yearbook, and they have set kind of a set of 10 standards that we can really think of as kind of the minimum threshold of quality. So these are the things that we would want every program to have at a bare minimum to be considered, on the road to quality. And as you can see, Michigan's Great Start Readiness Program actually meets all 10 of these benchmarks that have been set by NEAR. And Michigan is one of only 5 states whose public program meets those 10 benchmarks. So in some, in one sense, Michigan is doing really well at kind of setting that base threshold of quality. But as Chris kind of mentioned, there are still some pieces of Great Start that could be improved. And so one of them that we've already talked about is this idea of paying teachers at parity. So we know that the teachers who are working in the Great Start Readiness Program are making, $20,000, $30,000 less than their peer teachers who teach in the transitional kindergarten program and K through 12 teachers. And so high turnover has negative impacts on children. And so one way that we might be able to improve Great Start Readiness's quality is just improving the stability of the workforce in Great Start. And then another thing is that the Great Start Readiness Program does not currently have coaching and professional development that's aligned with evidence-based curricula. And Chris has a lot of great work about how important that is for quality. And so one of the things that could be improved would be, kind of thinking more about these instructional components of Great Start and trying to push the needle on the quality of the curriculum and also the support that teachers are receiving so that they can deliver those curricula well for children. And so finally, we wanted to talk a little bit about what the recent investments in the Great Start Readiness Program have been in Michigan to really highlight that Michigan has been focused on expanding this program, getting as many children who are eligible enrolled in the program as possible. So currently about 35,000 4-year-olds there are about 35,000 slots, and they are mostly filled in the state. And that's about $418 million invested per year in the program. But last summer, Governor Whitmer signed the new school aid budget, which included additional funding to expand Great Start. So it included mostly federal funds, but also almost $50 million in state funds. And the goal is to expand Great Start Readiness Program access to another 22,000 eligible children to really kind of push that needle to get those kids who are eligible for a Great Start into the program. And then one of the things that this money can be used for is increasing the per child funding. So there's some debate in the educational literature about money and outcomes that I'm sure you all have heard about, but increasing the per student expenditure can be helpful in terms of thinking about things like increasing teacher salary or increasing the quality of materials and instructional support.
And so we just wanted to end and then get to the conversation by just highlighting another state in which Anna and I and colleagues have worked, Washington, on a plan that would actually implement some of those pieces that we've been mentioning around teacher parity and turning the page on curriculum and instruction in that context. So this is a report with the link to a news article about it that we put out through the Education Policy Initiative here at Michigan. This was in partnership with Tim Burgess, who was the mayor of Seattle, who brought universal preschool to Seattle, along with Ruth Kagi, who was responsible really from 30 years of advocacy and legislation to improve early childhood investments in Washington state. So this is a collaborative project we did with them. And just to sort of get to some of the highlights around what a vision for moving to higher quality in Washington would look like, it would have things that the system currently doesn't have, like compensation and benefits around parity with K-12. Requiring a BA would be new for Washington. A full school day would be new for that program. It's mostly half day, unlike GSRP here. And then finally implementing the kind of curricula with coaching support. So it's sort of like Michigan using the same kind of curricula and has coaching, but it's not tied to implementing something that works. And so there's really kind of a missed opportunity that is happening in Washington as well. So with that, we are happy to kind of stop talking at you and pivot to questions. And thank you again for having us.
Chris or Ann, this is Sean. Just a question for you. For the states that are investing in 3- and 4-year-old quality pre-K, do they end up having a lower cost of education and obviously better outcomes for the kids through the whole system through K through 12? I guess my question is simple: is there an economic case, which I think all believe, that you can help us prove that by expanding quality and access, we actually save that money going forward? And I've seen different papers on this, but have you been able to gather some of that data to reaffirm that thought?
Yeah, so those benefits would really accrue in the form sort of most immediately in reduced special education placements, and then also in reducing retention, right? And so the best evidence for that is a paper that was led by Dana McCoy at Harvard, which is a meta-analysis of all of the rigorous studies that have followed kids, through that K-12 trajectory. And what that shows is that there were reductions overall on average in both of those, which would add up to cost savings. I don't think anyone has carried it through quite to the point of, so how much exactly would that have saved in those systems? Because again, some of these go back so far. 1965, that might be difficult to do, but the case is there in terms of the overall pattern in the literature. Special education, I would say, is a little bit of a funny one, and this is Anna's specialty, but what we really care about is that kids get the supports that they need to do well, right? And so in the short term, that might mean that actually, because they get seen earlier in preschool, that you see a spike in special education, right? But they might actually then transition out of that. And that's something that Anna's kind of looked at within Michigan data to try to understand the patterns at which kids transition out of special education versus don't. And so, it may be okay that in kindergarten you have more kids in special education if later on, perhaps they've transitioned out and they don't need it in middle school.
I just kind of go back and, Lou says this a lot, and I think he's dead on that. It's not only the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. It's more cost effective, it's more quality. And I think we need to keep in our advocacy work, continuing to bring facts to our legislators on why this makes sense.
This is Jim Brooks. Can you speak to, I've read some articles recently that raised some questions about programs in traditional K-12 school buildings not being as effective as maybe some of the other programs. And secondly, do you have any information about programs that are predominantly outdoors or include a significant outdoor component in terms of whether they're as or more effective?
Yeah, those are great questions. So this issue of public schools versus community-based programs is kind of a weird one. And I say that because, it's been hypothesized as one of the reasons for the Tennessee results. And so if you're not familiar with that study, It's a randomized trial. I've co-authored with one of the PIs of the study before, so I know him and the team well. And what they found was that initially into kindergarten, there was this boost on skills, like reading, math, the kinds of things that we would want to see. It was smaller than a lot of other programs, to be clear, from the beginning. But by third grade, it was null. And then into sixth grade, they're starting to see some things turn negative. And so that's raised a lot of concerns about what's happening. We don't know the reason this happened. So, for example, we don't know yet in Tennessee what the kids experienced from kindergarten onwards. The team hasn't done that work yet to kind of show for the full sample. Did they then go to really bad schools? Were they held back in some way? Like what exactly was going on for K-12? Another thing that's interesting in the study is that the newest results show that the negative impacts were actually concentrated entirely in the Latino subgroup in the third grade. And that's really contrary to what we see in other places. We tend to see Latino kids benefit more than anyone. And so it's a little bit of a funny pattern that we just haven't uncovered yet. So I think folks are kind of trying to throw mud at maybe it's this, maybe it's that, but we actually don't have, I can think of at least 5 different hypotheses for the Tennessee results. And what needs to happen next is that somebody goes through and kind of ticks off each one with the data and says, well, we looked at that, was not that. Oh, we looked at that, maybe it was that one. And that's just not happened yet. And so one of these has been that it was the public schools' fault, right? That they have kind of pushed down their standards. And that could be true. I would say that's one of my 5 as well. But there's no data to show that that's actually what happened. So what we do know nationally, and I'm leading a paper now that's looking at 5 large systems, we actually see more gains in public schools in these programs than the community-based programs. And that comes to this sort of long-standing problem in early childhood where a lot of these systems give more resources when the program's in public schools than when they're in the community-based centers. And so it's not a surprise then that the better resource programs produce, better outcomes for kids and higher quality, which is what we're seeing in these recent data on this paper that I'm working with, actually with the National Institute for Early Education Research. So, I think it's about figuring out in a really careful way, how do you scale quality in both places so that parents at the end of the day can pick whichever one makes the most sense for them. It shouldn't matter which door they go through, it should just be the better door for them. But right now, the reality is that actually, if you pick the community-based door in most places, the kids don't seem to be learning as much.
And outdoor?
Oh, yes, thank you. So that's really brand new. And I have been to one of these programs in Seattle. So the Seattle preschool program, I've been an advisor there since it began. And what happened was that an interested community provider came to them and said, hey, we really would like to try this. And so they actually had to modify all of their standards so that they could license those programs. And I visited one of them and saw the kids in their rain suits because it was Seattle in like February, right? So it's very rainy and they're outside the whole time. But we really don't have much data on them yet. I think it's really interesting. I think it's, again, it's going to matter what you do in them, right? As much as just that option. But as far as parents kind of getting choice, it's, even in Ann Arbor here, I have a kid who's 10 and a kid who's 2. And so I've seen the mix of things change between the 2 of them that are offered that we could be taking up. And so they are starting to proliferate and we need more evidence, but there hasn't been enough study, a particularly rigorous study. And in Europe, they have these everywhere, but Europe doesn't tend to do many rigorous early childhood studies.
There's a pretty significant outdoor program here put on by a group called the Outdoor Discovery Center. Mm-hmm. It's now getting into 3 or 4 different locations. They're claiming that they're getting very high performance results and that it's particularly effective with inner city minority kids that come into the program, maybe without the kind of the family stimulation that typically white kids would have. So maybe worth taking a look at.
Yeah. No, I think that's another area where it'd be great to have, a lot of what we need to do. We've spent so much time in the field worrying about preschool versus not preschool, even though at this point, the majority of families really want preschool. And so we're kind of at that transition point where it's not that that question isn't important, but like, how do we do it the best way and for whom is really more important. And so that's a great example where we need more evidence.
Thank you. A
That's
similar
kind of,
a question alongside of Jim's, maybe related to summer programs. Are there any best in class programs that you've been exposed to, or any data associated with pre-K summer high intensity programs as opposed to the normal full load, or in conjunction with the full load preschool?
Yeah, so there's one randomized trial that had looked at this in Chicago Heights, which is just outside of the city of Chicago. And so it was a nice study because they had sort of the full year of kids going, and then they had a different, and some kids have been randomized out of that, but then they got to go to the summer program. So it was a nice kind of, apples to apples comparison. And they did see that there were really, impressive gains that kids made just during that summer year. So it wasn't as big as the full year, right? And it's not going to meet parent work needs. But in terms of parents who maybe don't want to go to preschool, because we're always talking about voluntary programs, right? And we're always going to have families who say that's not for me. That summer right before does seem like you can get some bang for your buck. Now, we don't have very good evidence on different models yet. So it's another kind of how question, or a place to build evidence. In Boston, they offer this program too. So Anna and I have worked with them for a long time in a research practice partnership, and we've been able to do a small randomized trial of their summer programs. We only had enough kids to look at the kindergarten part and the first grade part, and there we do see impacts on kid learning. That's a great way to keep learning going over the summer and prevent summer learning loss. And then working parents are also very happy, right? Because summer is such a hard time for families, and moving kids around, and who can cover your kid this week. But many families like that option.
Thank you. And it might be great, if possible, afterwards, if we could get some contact information, especially on that the Chicago Heights location would be very helpful. So thank you for your comments.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
My question is, to what extent are the averages masking outcomes that are superior? Are you seeing a wide variety of outcomes from the programs, or are the averages pretty much, is it a pretty narrow band?
Mm-hmm. Anna, do you want to jump in, or?
I think in general, when we think about, I'm not sure if I've seen a study that looks like just at the distribution for the full sample of kids, but certainly there's a lot of evidence that preschool impacts can be bigger for certain groups of students. So we do see effects that are larger for dual language learners. And so I think it's definitely true that these kind of average impacts, when you look at the effects of a program, are often masking a lot of variation. And then there's also some good evidence that when you do like a big study, like the Head Start Impact Study, there's a lot of variation across centers. So like if you have lots of different preschool buildings with, different kids and different teachers, you do see a fair amount of evidence that there's variation in the impacts that are often correlated with things that we think are important, like, the characteristics of teachers, the quality of the centers. And so I think it's a really important point to be always thinking about when you're looking at a study of pre-K, not just like, does the average effect look good, but for whom is this program working? Do we see evidence that it works for some children and not for others? And how does that inform our understanding of how to improve the program? Because we definitely want preschool programs to benefit all the children that go. I don't think it's the ideal that you would have a program that only benefits a certain subgroup, but that can be really informative for thinking about like, okay, well, why is that? And trying to generate some hypotheses so you can think about improving quality or trying to understand the ways in which preschool is kind of filling a gap for one community and not for another community.
So following on that, do you have the ideal program in mind that if it were implemented in a community, we would have maximum impact.
Yeah, so that's Boston. For me, that's Boston. So I've worked with Boston since 2007 when I was in graduate school at Harvard, and just started working with the director there, who at this point has influenced what's going on in Latin America. I've been brought to China to talk about what Boston is doing, to learn from it. So what they have done is they have treated the teachers like K-12 teachers. They've paid them with parity, which in Boston, you have to have a master's degree actually within 5 years to teach in their public pre-K program. And they've implemented proven curricula, math and language and literacy combined together, that are fun and play-based for kids. They're not doing worksheets or playing games and having a good time, but they're actually really learning. And so I actually have in the video, I can send it to you. I have or in the slides, we put a little link to the program to see it in action. There's a video that I can paste into the chat as well, so you can see what it looks like in practice. So that's sort of a kind of North Star, but the thing that's tough in Michigan is that the curricula that we use in Boston, they're not allowed here. And that's not uncommon. It's not that Michigan is horrible or something. Like Anna showed you, like we're actually one of the strongest programs around the country, but we could do better. And the state has an approved curriculum list, and the curricula that are on it aren't allowed here. So programs have to, for example, if they wanted to use a math curricula, and I've talked to programs at conferences that would want to, who are at Grand Rapids or other places around the state, and to be allowed to use the building blocks curricula, for example, which is the most proven early childhood curricula we have. In Michigan, the programs have to gather data for years showing that their kids aren't learning math before they're allowed to adopt it. And no program has been able to do that, to kind of prove it. And so that's been a real barrier, I think, to not just Michigan. Washington has the same problem, and that's what we worked with them around how would you move that and what would it look like when we were talking with them. But let me paste that in as a.
So is there any mechanism to get waivers for that kind of work?
So there doesn't seem to be, like at this point in the state. So the state basically has, it rates curricula. A lot of states do this. It has a rubric, and it rates the curricula that are allowed across a different number of factors, and then it puts these ones on their list, right? And some states are so restrictive, like West Virginia only allows one curricula, for example, in their universal preschool program, and it's one that's been outperformed time and time again. So it's actually kind of a funny thing where in early childhood, states tend to control curriculum a lot more than they do in K-12. And in some ways you would think, oh, that's good. Maybe they're filtering out some of the bad stuff. But what's actually happened is they've kind of limited choices to the stuff that's less effective. And so Michigan, I've talked with them multiple times about this issue, as has my colleague Neil Duke, who's widely respected in literacy, is on the Literacy Commission task for the state of Michigan. And there's just not been a lot of interest in changing that.
Christina, kind of build on that. Is there a lack of is there resistance in the Department of Education?
Yes.
The Department of Uneducation. A question for you too. We've been advocates on GSRP increases, and we played a big role in the sort of the progression of funding going to pre-K and access, et cetera, childcare, et cetera. One of the things that we've been pushing on is the Michigan kindergarten entry observation. Ton of resistance from educators, but when you talk to certain soups like the one in Washtenaw, just passionate about it as a tool. What's your opinion of it or any entry observation to really understand where kids are as they're entering preschool as a method of improving their academic trajectory? Yeah.
So Anna and I are actually now with colleagues working on a study of Michigan DK, transitional kindergarten, begindergarten. It goes by about 100 names, and every time we talk to people, we learn a new one. but we want to use those data for the KRA, as it's called in Michigan. And so we've been also talking with Washington about getting access to those data. But in general, I think that's a really great assessment. It combines direct assessment, not just asking teachers' opinions of kids, which leads to a lot of bias. They're actually looking at what kids can do. It's actually a really good idea. And so we've been really disappointed that it was, first of all, placed in that weird position where Washington was carrying the ball for the team instead of the state. And then it got squeezed out in the last kind of legislative session that Michigan's going to discontinue doing it. And I don't think you have to use the KRA. There are other assessments. I've talked to Maryland because they also use the KRA and they're trying to push some improvements, right? So it's not as if the tool is perfect, but it's a pretty darn good one. And so I think it is a loss for the state that we won't have going forward those kinds of consistent metrics. Our team does want to get the data. We're hoping we'll get the data so that we can at least kind of use it to show, what you could learn from it. Because I think that's another one of the issues is Washington's had to carry the ball for the team again, and it hasn't necessarily had the supports that could really explain to legislators why that's so important.
I think it's also a huge missing piece in a lot of our data collection on our education currently, which is that most of the times when we want to see if a preschool program is working, we have to wait until the kid's in 3rd grade in order to have some sort of standardized assessment, which again, I mean, those are blunt tools, but they are at least standardized and they're used with all children. And so things like the KRA are really exciting because you can really start to understand the effects of programs soon after kids are in them and how things change over time. And so that's another kind of like, in terms of thinking about advocacy for KRA, like that as for researchers is obviously really interesting, but is also really helpful kind of for the system as a whole. The more kind of systematic data that we can have on kids, the better, because then we can think about improving their outcomes so that we don't get to 3rd grade and be like, oh no, they didn't pass the exam. They're not on grade level. Like these assessments can help us prevent that from happening as a sort of surprise. So I think in that sense, they're an important movement and hopefully one that will not lose all of its traction in the next couple of years.
And Michigan does require the literacy benchmarks now, right? So I think that's been one of the arguments that we don't need both, because in kindergarten fall, you would still do that. But districts use different tools, right? And so I'm on the Read by Grade 3 evaluation team that's led by Michigan State, and we're pulling all of those data and trying to learn from them, but it's really hard when no one in the state is required to use the same assessment. And so KRA was an exception where everyone going into kindergarten would have the same, the same measuring stick. So that's been disappointing. So I don't know, you guys are in the advocacy side. We kind of get data and try to go to legislators when we can. But I think hearing from the business community is really powerful.
Yeah, that's kind of, really in our wheelhouse, especially in early childhood. So it seems as though quality curriculum and the MKEO would be some low-hanging fruit with respect to getting the most out of our current investments as a state.
Yeah, I would just add teacher pay, right? So I know that the per child slot for GSRP has gone up, and maybe that is really supposed to go to teacher salary, but I'm just not clear on that myself, on whether that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to teacher pay, Christina, and the parity, do you have specific data that points out the damage to quality that happens with this turnover? Is there a specific link that you can point to?
So what we have, Anna's actually working on a randomized trial in Virginia in which they're giving out pay supplements to teachers. And so they're seeing more teachers, particularly in community-based settings, stick around a lot longer. I don't think anyone has carried it through to show directly through a causal design. So I'm kind of a randomized trial person. Like I teach people to do them at Michigan. So we see associations all the time between higher turnover and lower quality. But Anna and her team, I don't know if you guys are there yet on showing sort of the causal impact of turnover.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of thinking about, so we were able to show that giving teachers a pretty small incentive, it was about $1,500 if they remained employed for an 8-month period, which doesn't sound like a ton of money, but is a fairly large share of their overall salary, because these are the educators in Virginia are paid very poorly. And that very small incentive reduced the turnover rates in half. So it had a huge effect on the number of teachers that were able to maintain enough financial stability to stay in their position. We are interested in seeing if that has any effect on the outcomes of children, and we have a lot of kind of observational measures that are being collected for that. But another thing that we've done using data from Louisiana, which is not causal, but is kind of an interesting, and one of the first studies that we know of that's been able to do this, is to show how teachers improve over time in their quality. And so we can see that teachers do improve quite a fair amount when they stay in their centers. And so you can kind of extrapolate that to think, like, if teachers are turning over because they can't stay in their position, we're losing the quality gains that they're getting through experience because they're exiting the sector. And so we don't have any like direct clear links, but you can kind of extrapolate that teacher turnover is causing a loss of quality of instructors. And every time a teacher is a new teacher, they kind of start at the bottom and they have to grow over time. And so if we lose that benefit of growth, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot in terms of thinking about, improving quality, because we're not supporting the educators that are able to gain experience to improve the quality of their instruction for children.
So anytime you ask us a question, because we're researchers, we'll always have all of the caveats and things, but feel free to, I know we're nearing the end of the time, we'd be happy to follow up with like, what we're taught, like links to studies and more information on any of these topics.
Do we have data on the turnover in Michigan?
So the best I've seen is a Bridge magazine article that was quite good. Bridge, as you know, is often quite good on educational topics, and I can put that link in there. But it was pretty high, and it really was the voice in the article that it was about pay. Yes, and it was from 2021. And so, as we were talking about, we're evaluating now this transitional kindergarten program where if you're a family with a kid who's, say, going to turn 5 in October, if you live in a district that offers it, you can just send them there and you would get a teacher who is paid like a kindergarten teacher. So it's really putting the DSRP programs kind of in an unfair position around trying to keep their staff.
How much of participation? I'm sorry. How much of participation is based on parental awareness or unawareness?
So you mean like whether you join the program?
Yeah.
Like whether you enroll your kid? Yeah, it's a great question. So Anna and I looked at this in Boston, where any kid, regardless of income, could apply to go to that program. This was a paper that Anna led, and we found that there are lots of families that don't apply when it's available. And why that is a little bit unclear, but it tended to be in our data, particularly folks who didn't speak English as a first language. So it seemed like even though the city puts in the subways, and this is true in New York too, like it's just plastered with preschool ads in lots of languages, I think particularly for newcomers, it's kind of hard to figure it all out. And Detroit, I'm forgetting which group I was talking to, but they actually had an initiative where they wanted to start going door to door to just have face-to-face conversations, like, hey, you could enroll your kid, did you know? Which I think is a really promising idea.
And does time of day of the program have any influence on either quality or attendance?
Yeah, so what we know is that half-day programs are just really hard for parents, right? Because it just doesn't match your working schedule at all. So we see less take up of those programs and much more take up of privileged people when they are available, because they might have somebody around who doesn't work part-time or doesn't work full-time, or their family members to help. And so there is a randomized trial that shows that kids who go to full day have more learning gains in pre-K. And then we have all this evidence that when programs offer half day, that it's more advantaged folks. And then that some of those slots also just go unused because people just can't make them work.
Yeah, and I'll also say, like, we have a family survey that we've been conducting in Virginia each year, and we found that about 30% of our respondents reported that they needed non-traditional hours. So they either needed hours before 7 a.m. or after 6 p.m. or overnight or weekends. And this is kind of, I know we're talking really about center-based preschool here, but thinking about the broader system, like thinking about the way that childcare can support an early learning environment so that maybe kids are able to go to preschool programs for the school day and then benefit from the childcare system to support those non-traditional hours, because we know that a lot of families need those hours, and childcare systems as they're currently designed are really not able to support the number of families who need that type of care. And we also know that that's really correlated with the family characteristics. So it's especially common for working families, families between like 150 and 300% of the federal poverty line who need those non-traditional hours and don't have access to them.
Another question, I had to pop up for a little bit, so I apologize if this was asked or addressed. You talked early in the presentation the benefits of universal preschool, if you think about the K-12 system in Michigan, it's a very segregated by income, just because of our land use policies, et cetera. So, you know, if we did that in Michigan, I'd be worried, you know, the poor kids are getting put with the poor kids. And because the research from that you were citing talks about when you blend kids from different social economic groups, everyone benefits, but the lower income kids sort of accelerate quicker, but the benefits accrue to every child. Have you thought about how you would do that differently? In Michigan, to not have the same happen in preschool as you see happening in K-12 education with concentration of kids in poverty?
Yeah, so right now, one thing that's important to note, our early childhood programs are more segregated than K-12, right? So just getting them to K-12 would actually be important, but we probably shouldn't be satisfied with that for all of the reasons that you're mentioning. So one of the really interesting districts that's trying to take this on, I think, is Hartford, Connecticut. And the way that they've done that is that they've made the programs really interesting within the Hartford Public Schools, which is, you know, kind of a city that struggled with a lot of the same issues that, not to the degree that Detroit has, but sort of similarly. And so they've had, you know, like magnet Montessori this, or DC Public Schools has done this too. They offer like interesting combinations that you can't get anywhere else, like Mandarin immersion Montessori, right? And so what it does is it gives the folks who are higher income, it gives them something, right? So it's not sort of asking them to sacrifice for the greater good when they have their own child, because people just don't feel good about that. I know I don't as a parent either, right? Like, why should my kid pay for society's inequalities? Like, he's 4, you know, when you have a 4-year-old. But so I think some of that kind of creative thinking is really helpful around how do you create those pieces. And I think dual language programs is a really great example, because for example, like, you could really benefit from being around families who speak Spanish fluently and your kid doesn't, right? That's something that a lot of families want for their young kids. And so those kinds of creative thoughts or programs, I think, can help. But it's not an easy program. It's not an easy problem to solve for sure, because a lot of this comes from where people live, which is highly segregated.
Yeah, thank you.
Christina, you went by, I was watching your slides as you were going by there, and I may have misread something, but I think you showed a slide on classroom ratios that showed that Michigan was at 1 to 8 teacher to student, and that you were thinking 1 to 10 was probably, you could still achieve optimal results. Are those some of the tactical things where we can find ways to pair teachers more? Or did I misread that slide?
Anna, do you remember what it is you
Yeah, so that's the near benchmark. So Michigan has a 1 to 8 requirement, and the near benchmark is 1 to 10. So in that sense, Michigan seems to be doing a little bit better than what we would expect in terms of student to child ratio.
Okay, and then 1 to 8 gets markedly better results than 1 to 10.
We don't know that.
Yeah, we don't know that.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. I mean, I figure you put 2 more kids in, 2 more tuition. That's maybe a way that we close some of the pay gaps without eroding quality. Would be something we'd want to prove, obviously.
Yeah, and that's something Colorado. We have a very low ratio, and they've gone to university kindergarten there or pre-K, and they're raising their caps for exactly what you're talking about.
Well, Chris and Anna, this has been a fascinating conversation, and certainly appreciate you putting together specifically the Michigan to make it more relevant for some of the conversations that we want to have. For those on the call, I have been taking all the links from the chat, so the videos and some of the references and research that Christina was putting in there, and so we'll definitely follow up with those contacts. I definitely have plenty of notes, and I think even Kevin called it, you know, as we look as a working group for early childhood, where some of the advocacy efforts are that we can help support. And it's really great to hear the work with the MKEO, with Naomi over in Washtenaw, because we've been meeting with her and talking about, you know, what happened, how did it kind of, you know, fall, and where is MDE now, and how can we work together, not just here in West Michigan, but, you know, as a collective state to help move that forward. And so definitely some follow-up. But if it's okay with you as well, if I get your contact information and share that with this group, so that if there are further questions, we can individually follow up with you on that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, I'm raising 2 young kids in Michigan, so I'm always happy to help and talk with anybody who is trying to make a difference for kids here.
Very good. Good. Well, I appreciate everybody's time this afternoon, and sorry we went a little bit over, but I'll definitely be following up. And thank you again, Chris and Anna.
Thank you.
Yeah.